Welcome. This is the No Brain Left Behind podcast. All right, so this is part 3 of our series on Islam and on the Golden Age of Islam, the rise of modern science, and the contribution of Islam to theology, to philosophy, to science, right? Mm-hmm. And we left off. You were sharing about your experience as a campus minister going to campuses and talking with students, and noting that the way they perceive divine action is very different from the Christian mind, and that we have developed throughout history in philosophy and in theology based on the Bible. We tend to see God as creating an order with laws that are very defined, that are waiting for us to be discovered, to discover really through the tools of mathematics and physics, with a little part that is difficult to explain sometimes, which is divine intervention and miracles. How does God act in his creation? In the Christian mind is typically a suspension of the laws of nature. You also have some quantum interpretations of this by, the collapsing of the wave function within the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Islam is a bit different, very different actually. It seems like Al-Ghazali, the eminent philosopher, the preferred philosopher of Islam in the 12th century, ended up being so influential that his questioning of causality, just like Hume centuries later, led really the Islamic theology to lean towards an occasionalist mindset, which is to say that there's no laws of nature that are predefined and that are binding Allah. And therefore, it's kind of an occasionalist mindset where God is intervening at each step. So, for example, the example that Al-Ghazali took is to bring cotton and fire together. Why does it burn? It's not a necessity because of the laws of nature that Allah created, but it's just our intentions of bringing both together and Allah bringing a miracle, an action whereby he decides that the cotton will burn. So, and this is what you noted with the students on campus, that there's a different mindset.
Yeah, well, actually, to give, my Muslim friends a point, it's like when they're on the offensive against Christian thought, I've had experiences with Muslims that are, frankly, they don't necessarily understand the Bible in the way that, obviously I think to understand it is to believe it. And to understand it is to be convinced.
They might know verses, but they don't understand it.
Yeah, they don't understand it necessarily, but their study of it is rigorous. So when they're on the offensive, there's no lack of trying to reason you out of your belief in it through finding errors, which is essentially their main point. But when you turn that around and you question some of their own laws and beliefs, and you just bear down on one, like in a Socratic way, just like ask questions about one area of their belief and just the compatibility of that with their lived experience, you start getting this bifurcation where it feels like superstition. Superstition isn't the right word. It feels
dogmatism.
It's dogmatic, but in a way of like the true devout believers that I've talked to, it feels like they have a whole part of their brain that's devoted to this.
It's a cognitive
fantasy. Where there's a ton of work of angels and jinn and the working out of real world. I remember even in this discussion I referenced in the last episode where we ended, this one Muslim student referenced how, of course, Islam is true because of, there was a caliph that was able to go that harnessed the power of a jinn, which is like a demon in Islam, and was able to cover vast distances to go get a chair and come back in a moment, like a throne. And he referenced this story, which I'm not familiar with. Maybe we can find it in post. But he was saying, well, it must be true. I was like, that defies all reason that this spiritual entity went and grabbed
it defies all causal reason.
Causal reason, for sure. Went and grabbed a throne from somewhere else and brought it into a room in a blink of an eye. And because we know that's, they say stuff like, and because we know that's true, it's like, how do you know that's true? And doesn't that defy how you know stuff works? But they don't care because they think everything works that way.
But that's the key. They're divided, as you said, because if you ask them about the subject of studies like math or physics, they will enter in causal thinking entirely, without noting that they're not able to do so in their theology.
Which is some of what Dalal actually references, is that they start to separate science and philosophy and religion because of necessity. They have to
survive.
Can't survive. They can't say well, this is actually the way the world works according to the Quran. No, they have to say, well, this is the way the world works according to philosophy and science. And they start making delineations even with Aristotle, which are helpful, but it's serendipitous. It's not because they're well, this doesn't follow from our worldview theologically. It's that they have to separate their thinking because their religion doesn't follow natural reason and causality.
So you made the point in our, I think, episode 3, because this is our third discussion on Islam, but episode 3 of our podcast. So to make that distinction, you made the point that the Greeks had the ability to make observations and inferences, but they didn't have what you would call science, because they didn't have the ability of saying, based on this observation and this inference, I predict using mathematics that if you increase the velocity of a stone that's being thrown, that it will land in this spot, and that happens exactly. So it also seems to me like Islam is one of those cultures that we might say the reason why the sciences didn't flourish is because they seem to lack the fundamental belief structure that would allow them to predict anything. Because if you can't make inferences on causality, then you cannot also predict something, because God could choose to change his mind on lighting cotton when it's brought next to fire at any point in the future history.
And that's
so
you important.
Can't do science, because you can't say, if I increase the velocity of a stone that's being thrown at this
angle
increase,
and power,
angle and power, this increase, it will land here. If you can't say that, then you can't do what the West has come to call science.
Yeah. So as a refresher,
just as a point, and then the refresher, it's non-systematic.
Yeah.
You can't create a system of thought. So some of these brilliant guys were able to explain their theories, collect books. They were able to explain some of this to other people, but it wasn't understood as a system of understanding the world that could spread across the empire and everyone could understand this way.
Right.
It was very much cloistered because it wasn't causal.
I think that's incredible. I think that's a very interesting point. I think that's, because as we're talking about distinctions and things like that, that seems to be a massive distinction. Like what inhibits my ability to be scientific, my ability to make predictions.
Mm-hmm.
The scientific revolution is built on hypotheticals and then experimentations that prove hypotheticals or disprove them. But if you have a view of causality, which is that God intervenes at all points, then you cannot have a predictive view of the sciences.
Ultimately, as humans, we're wired for pattern recognition, and if you don't allow yourself to identify a pattern, it's so established a law in the back of your head, you cannot really master your environment as much. You might make exceptions because you're a merchant and you really need to sell something, and therefore you will notice that every time you count your money, it seems to line up nicely between what you have in your hand and what you have on your paper. So you're able to make limited
adaptations.
You might even have to turn off your brain and not even notice it.
So you're saying there's an
loading.
extreme cognitive dissonance within Islamic thought and science.
Super hot take loading, and it's sorry to use podcast speak, but essentially what is really kind of the edges of this are being outlined for me, and it might be a kind of a poor overlay, but I almost feel like what we're seeing is that Islam was not so much the beginning, their scientific discoveries weren't so much like the beginning of science. They were the kind of the end of the Greek version of science. They were the end.
Let me think about that.
Yeah.
Christian, the Christian Golden Age, the Christian Renaissance didn't like tagline onto this stuff and go like, well, we're going to take this and run with it and make it huge. It was essentially, because you think of the same cognitive dissonance existed in Greek thinkers. Like Aristotle's school was in the Temple of Apollos, from what I understand. Like he was still very much. Now they had like it seems they have a real loose kind of association with their religion and their thinking, and it was temple worship, and it was I don't understand it enough to give you like good details on it, but essentially they still held their religion and then their thinking, and they held them in at the same time, and they had deep cognitive dissonance. They had good ideas, but it wasn't because of their religion. It was in spite of it.
Sure. That's exactly what Ahmed Dilal say it's not.
Yeah.
So he contends that point.
Yeah,
but I tend to agree with you with this point.
Yes, and Dilal is a minority position.
And also
so he loses.
Even in the paper, he goes to great lengths to explain what all the distinctions that they made, and that was really important for science. Well, they made the distinctions. There's causality here. They made the distinctions because they weren't allowed to base their observations in from the Quran for the glory of Allah. Allah is not concerned with these things. That's not, and he didn't build that concern into you. It's not in there, where Christians can take, and again, I don't want to hold it in contrast to Christianity too much.
At every point.
But Christians can do that because it's made by God for us, and like our first command is like, hey, master the earth.
Yeah.
And then also the earth isn't going to be just destroyed and thrown away. It's going to be remade, and our physical, the physical form isn't going to end. Yes, we'll die, and there's a rebuild. We don't need to get into all the theology, but there's a strong ending teleology that's also still physical.
For sure.
And so
for sure.
That's not present in Islam. I feel like a strong association could be like Islam and its golden age was the end of represents like the end of Greek thought.
That's interesting.
Not the beginning of Western golden age science.
Yeah,
it's almost.
There's probably a lot there.
A paper on that. It's interesting. This is where we would have to explore in a future episode the connection between this, what we're talking about, and Aquinas, for example, the scholastics, how they picked up from where we left off here, where it was 12th, 13th century, so it was kind of the end of the golden age of Islam, and boom, we picked it up in the West, and we did something else with it, right? But what is interesting is, it's not very relevant right now, but what I wanted to say here is that it's really a shame because there's really some really good ideas in some Muslim thinkers. They're thinking right, and you don't know why it's not going further in that direction. Because, for example, if we take occasionalism, right, and we say, well, kata and fire could burn or could not burn. It is true for Christian as well. Like in the back of your mind as a Christian, don't you think like God is able to not make it burn if He wants to, like Daniel in the oven. What do you call this?
Sure, yeah, the furnace.
The furnace.
Yeah.
And his friends in the furnace in the Bible, right? So we believe that it's possible, but for some reason, we're taking it elsewhere. Because we think the same, but for some reason we think it's an exception rather than a rule, and they think it's a rule rather than an exception, and it changes everything. So anyways, we have to look into this. But
that's interesting.
But the fact that God is also not bound by His own laws, it's something that I deeply believe as well. In some sense,
Listen.
Yeah.
You first, and I'm going to give you the really dumb street version of this. That's it's not dumb. It's brilliant, but it's a street version.
So I've written a set of lectures called "What is Theology," and the essential contention of my lectures is that theology is always a response to God's self-revelation. So it takes something.
It's a disciplined response.
It's a discipline. Dang, he knows it.
I remember.
It's a disciplined response to God's self-revelation. What that means is that for a Christian, the term "could God create a rock so large He can't lift it" is not a theological question at all. It's actually a purely philosophical question. At best, it could be called theological abstractness, which does nothing for us.
Explain to us why. Because a lot of people are puzzled by this. At first, how do you call this? when you see it like superficially,
Yeah,
when you see the problem, the question,
Yeah.
you still struggle a little bit with
It's
it.
intriguing
It's
because
intriguing, yeah.
it's the premise. The premise is the problem. So it's inviting your reasonability into a faulty premise.
And this is why, because that's never the way theology was done. Hebrew theology is always a response to God's revelation. It is never abstractedness, right? Hebrews are never, when they're writing their history, which is what the theology is built on, right? The Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, abounding.
Deuteronomy.
Yeah, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind.
Leviticus, yeah.
And then the other one is that in Exodus 36, I think, when it says, the Lord, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, right? Forgiving the iniquities of 1,000 generations, yet holding accountable those who sin against him to the third and the fourth. That's not an exact quote. That happens in the context of God placing Moses in the cleft of the rock and passing by him and exclaiming those things about himself, right? So everything that Christian theology has ever had to say about God is based on God's self-disclosure,
Yeah.
right? The doctrine of the Trinity in the New Testament goes beyond that and says that exact same thing, right? The term Trinity is not used in Scripture. It is an endeavor to explain as best we can in human language the nature of God as God is revealed in the Father through Jesus Christ and by the Spirit, right? So it has always been... Theology has always been, from the very beginning in its Hebrew roots, a response to God's self-revelation. That is where theology operates. It cannot operate outside of that. When it operates outside of that, it's pure speculation. It's not even properly called theology. From a Christian point of view, it's not even properly called theology. It's properly called philosophy.
So is it a good
Or
philosophical
fantasy.
question?
Or fantasy.
So is it a good philosophical question to ask whether God can create a square circle or create a rock that he...
Sure, it might be an interesting philosophical conversation to have. It has no bearing on God's self-revelation and is given this.
Sure.
It is not theological by definition. I would say that is not a theological question because it is not a response to God's self-revelation in a direct sense. Because you have to have parameters on theology. And the parameters are
Sure.
What has God disclosed about
Just like
himself?
science. Just like
Yes.
science, yeah.
What has God disclosed about himself? So I don't know through abstract reasoning whether or not it's sensible to say that God can put a round peg in a square hole. That doesn't even make sense based on experience.
What is your street version of this?
So I think as a premise, so it jumps off of a lot of what he just said, but you don't get the time in like a normal conversation to give him like a real passionate, kind of passionate preaching moment on that. But it's essentially built on the fact that God, what he does in nature, it's actually when he does intervene in nature and change some material thing, there's a miracle. It's always consistent with what he's already done. So it's to an end that's based in something you can take from Scripture. Like this is something that I've seen. I mean, we can. There's whole volumes on miracles that we could go into, but essentially, like the stuff you can at least tangibly work with, and there's like good accounts of miracles that have happened, are all consistent with the nature God has revealed in Scripture and in history.
Right.
And he's also an active agent in time space. Like that's something that he's guaranteed through the Holy Spirit. He said, I'm going to send you the Comforter, and he's going to be with you, and he's going to teach you all things.
And obviously Jesus was within
And Jesus was within space-time too, but I'm saying like it's continued from then. Just to give people context, like that's what Christians believe, that the Spirit's active now and can manifest in certain ways.
Totally.
And exampled in the New Testament when he does this stuff.
Yeah.
So one of the really simple illustrations I'll use is like, I'll pull out my phone with somebody. I'll say, God can do miracles because Apple can update your phone. Okay? And there's a relationship between you and God, and when he delivers some miraculous thing into reality where there is some volition from you generally, but there's also some work that he has in his mind to do for you. And the process of it happening is either revealed post hoc or is to not post hoc, but in post of like after the miracle, or it's something to confirm something the Spirit has put in you before the miracle happens. And the miracle acts as like Christian circles often call a confirmation of God's intention. This is pretty tedious language, but essentially it's not wrong for Apple to send a message to your phone that says, would you like to update your software or not? It's right. It's within the contracts of use of your iPhone, is that you have a piece of hardware that doesn't necessarily change, which is where the analogy breaks down, but the actual software and how the thing is used can change based off of the central command that makes the software sending out an update, and it can change it. And that's not against the rules. That's within the rights of the people that have created the thing that you're using.
So you're making the argument that miracles don't function in contradiction to nature. They function in accordance with it because everything that happens...
Yeah, it might be outside of our experience.
Full stop, everything that happens is within the context of... within the rules of play, within
yeah, because I actually...
action.
And this is something I have to do all the time in conversation with budding intellectuals that are on college campuses that are in their undergrad and they have deep questions and I want to address them nicely. I go, look, because a lot of them bring up, well, what about this? What if this possible? What if a square circle or a rock too heavy for God to pick up? I always bring it back, and this is a useful tool for anybody listening that wants to try this kind of stuff. Is like, it's not about what's possible. Okay, anything's possible theoretically, but also like you can't there's a point at which you can't prove something can't happen, like because there's always the next moment. Like something could happen outside of our experience that could change the nature of, that's why alien movies are cool. Like, oh, what if it happens? But then I frame it. I say it's not about what's possible. It's about what's likely given the evidence. And I always go like this, and it helps them visually go, oh, yeah, my contention against God isn't about, well, what if God's this way, or what if it's actually this way? It's about what has already been revealed about this God person, and is it consistent with nature, and is it consistent with how my brain works?
So we got to bring this. Always this in your response. We need to couch it within.
That's not how I usually illustrate it in
the context of Islam.
That's why I wanted to go back to it. Is that this is answering a different question? I feel the question that we still have to contend with as Christians. If there are laws of nature such as God is infinite in every way, therefore there cannot be a rock, that is too heavy for him to lift, and therefore God, there's prohibitions that we attribute to God. And the question is why in Christianity we think it's okay to put prohibition on God's power, or because God cannot be illogical, he cannot be he cannot be...
No, I think it's better. I think there's something better, a way to approach this. And it goes back to something we've discussed, maybe off camera. It could have been on camera at one point, where I talked about Christianity orients you forward. Like, it's not like a fixed quantity. It's actually, you're taking part in the revelation and the story, which we talk about this a lot, and I talk about this with you guys all the time, maybe not on camera, but like, narrative is the most powerful... It's the most powerful way to orient ourselves in reality. Like it's like, there's a story being told, and Christianity has an end. Like there's a serious thing we're heading towards that makes a lot of sense. But we're active participants in God's revelation to us. Like so the better way to say is like, well, the easiest way around, like, can God create a rock that's too big for him to lift? Is, I don't know. Like, I've never seen a rock he can't lift. It's not pertinent. It's like, sure, like, I don't know, but like, maybe we'll get there someday. That there will be a rock that's too big. You're talking about it in definite terms. It's like, well, time's not over. The story's not done.
It's really the key of the difference between what we're talking about, which is Islam and occasionalism versus Christian thought. So that's why I really want to...
You got to understand, though, it's not... This is the way to help people move through these issues. It's not an answer because there is no answer.
No, but I'm not talking about the field and trying to help someone right now. The question is to make a distinction between the Islamic thought and Christian thought. And Christian thought is seemingly okay with building prohibitions on God's nature to allow for such things as the laws of nature.
What prohibitions are you referencing exactly? Because I feel like I missed the point.
If God cannot create a square circle, it's a prohibition.
But that's not what we're saying.
But that's exactly.
That's not what Christians are saying.
All I'm saying is that's not even a theological question.
It's not a theological.
We're just talking about three different things.
Well, no, but the thing is, you gotta ground this in some sort of actual.
No, but let's go back to Islam here.
Okay.
Islam, we just landed on the fact that it seems like they could not achieve science the same way we achieved it in the West because they were not open to the idea that God could have created laws He cannot break.
Right.
All right.
So
that's the key.
Yeah.
And the question is, how it come us Christians we're okay with worshiping and knowing a God and saying, well, He's also limited in this way. He cannot be illogical. He cannot create a square circle. He's bound by laws.
That's not in the Bible. That's not a biblical.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's in the Bible or not in the Bible, but this is part of the Christian.
You can't
story.
represent it as you can't represent that as a unique. That's a Christian thing that we put that prohibition on God because it's not a Christian thing. Some Christian thinkers have said that.
So
but it's not part of the. Okay. It's not part of our theological understanding of the world. That's just a question, and it doesn't have an answer, and we're okay with it. The Christian perspective is okay with it because we're part of the story. We're going, maybe there's a humongous rock somewhere in the universe.
Not Christian theology, Christendom. So it means the environment, the Christian environment in which we operate and in which modern science arose.
Yeah.
How come that theology, maybe the Christian theology, the answer is that Christian theology is disinterested in that question, and therefore it's allowed for philosophers to come up with laws, the ideas of laws of nature and God being bound by laws.
And this is a whole nother topic in some ways. But I don't know if I think it was the first episode when I talked about Hans Fry and his types of theology.
Yeah.
And so I would situate philosophy underneath theology.
Yeah.
It serves theology. Mm-hmm. And so not only is the square circle question not theological, but it also doesn't even serve a theological...
Because philosophy is under theology, so it doesn't make sense in theology and in philosophy.
Well, theology is where you get your purpose.
So for me, personally, that question is a complete non-starter. It does not allow us to advance, to make any conclusions. It's inherently non-scientific. And it is also fundamentally not theological because theology is also and always a disciplined response to God's self-revelation. Now, to relocate that into a sphere of, say, love, right? God does prohibit Himself. He cannot not love. Mm-hmm. There is no reality in which God cannot love. So that's a theological consideration.
So that's not a law so much that it's imposed on Him. It is what He is.
Right.
So that's different. That's a different thing. It's not
right. And I would say I agree with that distinction. And then I would say logic is not something that God is bound by. For instance, logically, do people get out of graves when they die?
No.
They do not.
Well, okay, there's something to that. Well, you can finish your thought.
Logically,
yeah,
they do not get out of graves.
Right,
Unless you have something
weird.
Yeah. It's not, well, it's not illogical. It's translogical.
Right.
So it supersedes out. This is derived from His holiness. He's other than us.
Right.
And He is, again, He's revealing Himself and the possibilities of the natural world and the possibilities of what His nature has to us.
Right.
And it doesn't prohibit Him from breaking any of the rules that we think there are, because they're not necessarily rules. They're part of His revealed nature. Mm-hmm. So we're living like within His nature. We're not living within a construct that He made for us. It's like in Acts 17 it says, "In Him we live and move and have our being." It's not saying He's created a world that we live in and move in and have our being. He's saying literally all of creation exists within Him and obeys His nature. So, and His nature is revealed in parts. So when miracles happen, those don't break the laws of nature. They reveal another part of who God is. And there can be things that appear to us to be anomalous within that process, but they're not. He's being consistent with His nature.
Okay. So assuming this is how Christendom thought between 1500 and 1700, how could you infer from the nature of God and from the Bible that there are laws to be discovered without contradicting or, without, rubbing against what you just said, basically?
I think unto the glory of God. Like we're discovering God's nature.
Okay, so open-mindedness to whatever comes our way.
Yeah, the process wasn't in restricting God's. It wasn't in restricting God's nature. It was in finding the boundaries of His nature, and that if had been revealed to us and can be revealed to us.
Boundaries of His nature.
Yeah, and I think concretely the doctrine that would allow us to move forward on this is the doctrine of the Incarnation. God gives Himself in history and in space and time to be known. There is no Kantian distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal. There is no distinction between my experience of God in Jesus Christ and God's self, right?
As Luther said, the one who...
in the man Jesus,
yeah.
you know God.
You know God.
Right? Something like that, I think
Yeah.
Luther says. So Christian theology implies knowability by the fact that God has given Himself to be known. So when you're asking what is the distinction that maybe Christianity has that Islam doesn't have,
Yeah.
it's
Incarnation?
Yes,
That's pretty deep. If we
I
land
like
on
that.
this...
I like that.
No,
Wow.
it is. I've already landed and
But
unpacked
also-
my bags and I'm on the tarmac.
You know what?
It is.
And
It
also,
is the distinction.
It is
Everything is theology.
Everything's theology. I think the motivations are there, and it allows there to be to break kind of the old trope of like there are stupid questions.
Yeah.
There are questions that don't matter.
Yeah, there are.
And there are questions that are not consistent with God's nature. And we
Or with the reality, I guess.
or with which is reality.
Which is reality.
So but we don't have to be as scared of nonsensical questions because we can actually just say maybe they'll happen in the future. Maybe some resolution will happen. We don't know or care. Let's talk about what we know. Let's talk about the revealed nature of God that we know and build on that and not take pot shots at possibilities, which seems silly right now. Maybe they won't be silly later, but right now they're silly.
I'm a bit uncomfortable right now because you guys both said everything is theology, and I remember what you just said, that theology undergirds philosophy. So we're reaching the boundaries of philosophy right now.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I have no problem with that.
Right.
I have no problem with that. Build a big fence and let's talk about what ought to be discussed.
Let's
what
take
ought
it
to
back
be
to
discussed.
Islam.
Yeah, let's go back to Islam.
Take it back to Islam.
Yeah.
These are some of these that we have. I think we've really landed on the distinction that made Islam's golden age come to an end because,
They refused Jesus
well,
and the Incarnation.
there's a problem within their theology that holds them back from entering that space with God that lets him that discovery process that you can obviously see in the writings of guys like Copernicus, who I keep going back to, or
Kepler,
that,
especially.
they are in awe of God and in relationship with Him, and they feel Him, and it's tangible. They're having real experiences with God as they discover, and they're elated in it, and it's like a worshipful experience for them to do this. That's restricted from Muslims whose construct of God is severe, is dangerous, non-material. It's not going to interact with you. There's a hope that it might interact with you at the end of your life if you can go into heaven, if you play your cards right. It's austere, it's removed, and that companionship with God, I think, is one of the core things that drew some of the discoveries from the greatest thinkers in the Renaissance, and it's not there for Muslims.
It's really interesting because because we talked about how the Arabs, especially under the Abbasids, between 750 and I would say 1258 until the Mongols, let's say, how they were tapping into the knowledge around their location. And at the beginning, especially, it was Indian culture, Persian culture, and Greek, and then they became more interested in Greek culture. But when they were tapping into the Indian knowledge, this is where they got the numbers from, the numerals, especially the zero, and they were able to develop algebra. But what is interesting is that the Indians have had this for a long time. And we will have to also, I guess, study a little bit Hinduism at some point to understand why there was no push or motivation to go further and try, just like the Arabs, because the Arabs, they went a little bit further, but they also stopped at a certain point where I guess their worldview did not allow them to have enough imagination or have the proper boundaries to explore really the universe. And so it would be interesting to compare Hinduism and Islam when we will know more about Hinduism, because they had kind of the same problems as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can.
And let me postulate, and this is bouncing to you. Is it an incarnation problem? Is that like an inhibitor for human thought? Is like an origin?
Yeah, I certainly don't know
Question?
enough about Hinduism to speak on it really in any capacity. I do know quite a lot about Christian theology.
So,
I do know quite a lot about Christian theology, and I would say that certainly the West and the advancement of the sciences is because of the doctrine of the incarnation. I'm not the only. By the way, I'm not making that up. I'm not the only one who believes in that.
we need some references.
So T.F. Torrance, for instance, would be someone whose entire scholarship is based on the idea of the centrality of the incarnation for the advancement of scientific thought, and a very, very influential.
Do you have a
theologian
book
in the
you
West.
recommend?
Man, some of them are out of print.
But
He
where
was writing in the
specifically
60s.
tackled science and
So
incarnation.
he's got a book called it's called Space, Time, and Incarnation. He also has a book called Space, Time, and Revelation. And then these are sort of essays in sort of the craft of theology. He also has a text called The Ground and Grammar of Theology, which is very good. And so, yeah, those would be maybe 3 texts that I would put forward for Torrance. So I'm not saying that I'm making these concepts up. I think that there is a lot of credence to the idea that the incarnation as a doctrine is that foundational concept which allowed, even in the earliest centuries of the church, for there to be scientific thought, like real sort of progress in scientific thought. And whether or not we can map that, I think we've mapped that onto Islam in this conversation, at least the lack of that point of contact between God and creation, establishing knowability of creation.
That's true.
We've sort of mapped that on in Islam right here. I'm not sure whether or not you could map it on as cleanly within Hinduism, because I'm not familiar with their pantheon. I think they're non-material, or at least, yeah. So all of that aside, is I think maybe what we've landed on is that Islam does not have a point of contact in their theology between God and creation.
Yeah. That's really interesting, because in Islamic theology, essentially, you might think that God is all merciful, therefore He sent Jibril, right, to give you a special revelation, which is great in one sense. But on the other sense, when you learn more about the nature of Allah through Islamic texts, you discover that He doesn't really want to be with you or next to you. He's too holy to be with you, and therefore, even if you get saved in their eschatology and in their soteriology, you most likely will be in one level of heaven. Muhammad will be maybe closer to Allah, and Allah will be basically
Still beyond.
very, very high, inaccessible. So Allah is inaccessible. He is all-knowing. He knows better, and He will not explain anything to you, and He doesn't want to be with you. And the Quran multiple times, because Muhammad was preaching against polytheism, so he constantly repeats Allah, supposedly allegedly repeats in the Quran, and Muhammad writes it down, that don't say 3, there's only one. Don't say 3, there's only one. Do not associate anybody with Allah. There's only one God, etc., etc. So he's very adamant about the fact that even when he talks about Jesus is referenced, I think 30 or 20, maybe 25 times in the Quran, and a lot of the passages about Jesus is to clarify who He is not, and this idea that he is the Son of God, for example, is definitely blasphemy. And so refusing incarnation seems to have an impact on who you become as a culture and as a civilization. I'm not connecting the dots fully yet, but I guess when I think about what we talked about with human Kant, the idea of having an in between to have a proxy to know the unknowable through something that steps into the knowable for you, which is the definition of incarnation, is a very troubling, at the very least, very troubling analogy or more for what could be true about deeper things. Not deeper things, but about
Troubling
essential
in what
things.
sense?
In the sense that if it's really the ground of reality, incarnation, then refusing incarnation would mean that you miss out on things such as causality, like the full extent of causality, what it means, and therefore you miss out on the full extent of what science is.
Totally. I know that's a big
like
statement. I know, yeah, it's a big statement. It really is. And I'm also here for it. So, I would love to continue on that conversation. I think that, simply put, I would say I probably agree with that. If you do not have a doctrine of the incarnation, then I don't know that there's a real persuasive grounds for saying anything like I can know the world. So I think that reasons why Hume's criticism went so far, or even Al-Ghazali's in some ways, is because he wasn't operating within that fundamental conception of reality. He was operating outside of that fundamental conception of reality.
Yeah.
Because there's a deep gentleness in God stepping into reality himself and saying, I'm going to be the point of contact. I'm going to be the... actually, logos, the word that is used in John, is arguably a Stoic term, Platonic term for the ground of reality, the reason behind everything.
Yeah.
Not just the word as just a word, but it's the philosophical concept, I think, is very intentional in John.
Absolutely.
And therefore you cannot escape the importance of incarnation to have access to all of reality, including science, for example.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Very
Anything you
good.
wanna add?
Yeah, just from a human, like a real solidly human, normal guy perspective. Normie.
Debatable.
Not probably normie, but essentially when it comes to how we interpret this stuff and all these ideas, it's about establishing trust in a person that they've done the work to understand what they're telling you, and that it corresponds to reality in a way that you can understand.
Yeah.
And that creates kind of an infinite regress if you don't have someone that proves something ultimate, that they have ultimate authority. Because we're just like, that's the system of getting a PhD. Like, hey, this guy's got an authority because we've looked at all of his work and it seems to be true, and we have bestowed this on him. But it doesn't make you the authority on the universe. It makes you an authority on a limited
very
subject,
small topic,
very small thing. But you expose yourself to the rigors, the tests to get that thing. So in a very simple way, what the incarnation does for humans is that it stops the infinite regress of authority. And because Jesus came back from the dead, it proved that he has ultimate authority over life and death. And he has a command of physical reality in a way that we can trust him. Because everything you believe and think, someone said. You are like a minority shareholder in belief.
In the history of thought.
You're a minority shareholder in a bunch of other people's ideas.
Totally.
So you're if you're a YOLO person, someone said YOLO for the first time.
Yeah.
You're like a disciple of the YOLO guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So examining your thoughts, examining your beliefs, where's the origin? Where does this regress stop of like who's right about how reality actually is? You have to create a test that so only one person can pass. This is how it would. This is like the incarnation, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ is exactly what you need.
Totally.
to explain reality.
And it's not Christians reaching for it and being like, because we need it, we're going to claim it. Because theology was a response to revelation. People saw what they wrote, or people wrote what they saw in Jesus Christ. They witnessed his self-revelation post-resurrection and previous to the ascension. And Paul has that moment in Romans, 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about he showed himself to Peter and then the apostles and then the 500. And many have fallen asleep, or else you could go ask him. He says many have fallen asleep, which means they've died. But the implication is if they weren't dead, you could just go ask him. And then last of all, Jesus appears to me, right? It's this cipher for it as a testimony in early Christianity to the external reality of the resurrection. And you're right. Without the resurrection, that's the thing that actually, what word did you use? It doesn't solidify the claim to incarnation. It sort of, ratifies it. Like there has to be a resurrection, or else
it's the stamp on his life.
Yeah.
If the resurrection didn't happen, Jesus is a really nice guy with some crazy ideas.
Yeah. And ultimately a blasphemer.
If he does come back from the dead, that means there's a stop to the infinite regress. There's no more angels choking dudes in caves. Mm-hmm. There's someone that has proven without a shadow of doubt. It doesn't need he didn't know how to write, yet he wrote something. Okay, cool. That's a fun parlor trick. No one in history has so publicly died and so publicly been claimed to be alive again afterwards.
Yeah.
After a group of people that are so good at killing people, for sure kill you.
Yeah, they don't botch it.
The
Romans don't botch execution.
And then you don't get a botch. Maybe he was just holding on to life in that cave for 3 days. Sure. No.
Yeah.
I mean, we can get into defenses of the resurrection another time.
Theory is ridiculous.
But my point was saying, if there's going to be some arbiter of ultimate reality, the test he would have to pass to gain confidence in really smart people
is resurrection.
Is a resurrection.
Yeah.
Any other test wouldn't convince me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I would rest it, and that's the gospel.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a great point to end this episode, and we'll be back. We'll talk more about Islam. We'll talk more about the resurrection, and we'll talk more about the scientific contribution. We'll keep studying these texts and study also the relationship with the Byzantine Empire and the West in general. All right. Well, this was the No Brain Left Behind podcast.